I'm Hannah Whitaker, 34 years old, and I'm sitting in a law office that smells like lemon polish and old money, trying to keep my hands from shaking on the armrests, while my mother and sister pose like this moment is a photograph they've been practicing for, and the man behind the desk clears his throat as if the truth needs tidying before it's spoken. The room is all mahogany and framed degrees, the kind of place where decisions look permanent. My stepfather's name, Dr. Robert Hale, glints on a brass folder, even though he's gone from this world a week. Brooke squeezes my fingers so the attorney can see us being close, a stage whisper of family unity. My mother's pearls catch the light. Her black dress doesn't dare wrinkle. Outside the window, Boston moves as if today is ordinary. Inside, I sense the one sentence that will upend what we call family is already waiting in Alan Mercer's briefcase. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to keep your voice steady while someone else decided what you're worth. I grew up in a small New England town where we kept extra chairs by the back door because there was always room for one more at supper, and you learned to hold doors, tell the truth, and leave a place better than you found it. My mother Marion prized polish-pressed hems, thank you notes, the right faces at the right events, and when she married Dr. Hale, our lives moved from modest to manicured with quiet speed. We came to Boston and learned new rules, foundation galas, second plates at fundraisers, and names on engraved place cards, while at home the air was thinner, like we lived slightly above real life. Brooke took to that world like she'd been born for it. She speaks sponsor codes the way some people say grace. I learned a different language. Paper trails, dates, and marginalia, the comfort of records that don't pretend to be anything but what they are. The archives became my steadier home, where leather spines and thin ribbons marked the places people tried to leave a faithful record of themselves. I make a living lending order to other people's history, which is sometimes easier than facing your own. Dr. Hale kept his distance politely, as if pride had a checklist he could never find my name on. He shone the brightest light on Brooke and let the rest of the house adjust to the glare. Still, he funded scholarships with care, argued policy with precision, and built a medical company that changed lives. Hale Medical Technologies was stamped on lab coats and conference banners, and on winter mornings I'd watch the building lights turn on across the river like the city was waking up one floor at a time. When he died, the condolence cards came in stacks. The casseroles came with handwritten labels and the promise of refills. We gathered in Mercer's office a week after the funeral, and the room behaved like a witness, quiet, polished, holding its breath with us. Alan read the ordinary first, the house to my mother, the lakeside place to Brooke, the old investments set aside with tidy labels. Then he paused, and the pause said more than the papers, the way a careful archivist will slide a gloved hand above a page before touching it, because what comes next can't be undone. He looked up and met my eyes as if to ask permission to keep going. My mother adjusted her sleeve. Brooke straightened her smile. I folded my hands and waited for the line that would change the story I've been living, the line that sounded like a condition and felt like a test. Alan pressed a single envelope with my name onto the table, and when he began the sentence, I understood that the past we've rehearsed for 30 years was about to meet the record we could no longer avoid. Alan's voice carried across the polished table like a sentence already decided. He explained that my share of the estate, the company itself, and the largest portion of liquid assets would only pass to me if a DNA test confirmed my connection to Robert Hale. The words struck with such clarity that even the air seemed to pause. My hands pressed into the leather of the chair, trying to keep still, while Brooke's nails grazed my arm in a show of sympathy meant more for the attorney than for me. Mother leaned forward, pearls catching the light, her voice smooth but sharp enough to cut. "Surely, there's another way, Alan." Robert was always dramatic in his paperwork. She spoke as though my father's last instructions were a performance to be brushed aside. Brooke chimed in, her tone carefully rehearsed. "Daddy loved to make things complicated, Hannah. This must be one of his jokes." Her laugh tinkled in the heavy room, but her eyes never met mine. Alan removed his glasses and polished them with deliberate care. Dr. Hale was very specific. The DNA must be collected by an accredited laboratory, verified against his own sample, and authenticated by a second set of markers already filed. Without that, the inheritance is redirected." He let the word settle. "Redirected?" I asked, my voice catching. "To medical charities and to Mrs. Whitaker and her younger daughter," he answered with a steady tone, his gaze sliding to my mother and Brooke, who exchanged the faintest glance of agreement. Their silence said enough. They were already rearranging plans in their heads, calculating deposits, memberships, and the lifestyle that required uninterrupted funding. I kept my breathing, even though my chest felt tight. In that moment, it was clear the condition was not just about money. It was a public challenge to my very place in the family. The office door opened, and Diane appeared practical as ever, with a blazer too plain for my mother's taste, but more comfort than anything else in the room. She raised her brow when she saw the tableau, then looked only at me. "You look like you need coffee and air," she said plainly. I stood smoothing my skirt, grateful for her presence. Alan nodded respectfully. "Call me tomorrow. We'll arrange the testing." Mother's voice followed me as I left. "Hannah, think carefully. This could bring unnecessary embarrassment." Her words wrapped in concern but carrying a warning. Brooke offered a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. Diane positioned herself between us and led me out of the office, her steps measured, as if shielding me from their rehearsed performance. 3 days later, I was back in the archives, the climate-controlled air carrying the faint scent of paper and leather. My phone buzzed across the desk where I was sorting Civil War letters. Brooke's name lit up the screen. "They're on their way to your place," I said quietly, and Diane looked over the stack she was cataloging. "Want me to stay late?" she offered. I shook my head. "No, I'll face them." By the time I pulled into my building, Mother's silver car filled the visitor space. Inside, they were waiting on my couch and in my reading chair as if they owned the room. Brooke rose first, brushing a hand across one of my framed botanical prints. Mrs. Abernathy next door let us in. She remembered Mother from a charity auction. Her voice carried the kind of practiced warmth that photographs well but leaves no real trace. I hung my coat without offering theirs. "What brings you here?" I asked evenly. Mother smoothed her skirt as though it needed perfecting. "Darling, we're worried about you. This whole condition in the will, it's so unnecessary." Brooke leaned back, crossing her legs, her tone clipped but soft enough to sound reasonable. "We've spoken with another attorney. There are ways to work around it." Alan had been firm. There were no ways around it. The instructions were clear. I said standing rather than sitting. The DNA test is required. Mother's laugh was quick, brittle as frost. "Alan has always been rigid. Robert, too, always demanding proof signatures verification for the smallest matters." Her words caught my attention. "What do you mean?" I asked. She sighed fingers at her pearls. "Robert never trusted easily. He hired investigators before we were married again after Brooke was born. He lived on suspicion. This test is just another expression of it." The picture formed slowly. His journals, his insistence on documentation, his cool detachment patterns, not just with me, but with everyone around him. "He did this with business contracts, with board meetings," she continued. Brooke nodded in agreement. "It wasn't personal, Hannah. He was like this with everyone." I remembered moments I had tucked away. His reluctance to look at my report cards, his fixation on Brooke's piano recitals, his sharp questions about loyalty I didn't understand at 12. The test wasn't a whim. It was part of a lifetime of suspicion carefully kept under the surface. My sister shifted impatience, slipping into her polished tone. "This delay isn't good for anyone. My brand launch depends on the inheritance. The contracts are already signed." Her eyes flickered nervously. Mother's club dues. Brooke's renovations, the lives they had built on Robert's money, all of it required my compliance. We could come to an arrangement Brooke offered carefully. Split things evenly and no one has to be embarrassed. I looked at her, recognizing the fear behind her words. Embarrassed, I asked. "Isn't that what you said?" She faltered. "Mother always said Dad was paranoid after you were born." Mother cut in sharply. "Brooke, enough." But the slip hung in the air like a loose thread. My phone buzzed again, Diane this time. "Found something in the hospital archives. Call me." I looked back at my mother and sister. "I need you both to leave. I have an appointment." Brooke started to protest, but Mother placed a hand on her arm. We'll continue this later. Remember, Hannah, family matters should stay private. Their exit was as rehearsed as their entrance, practiced smiles until the door closed behind them. I dialed Diane immediately. She answered on the first ring. Hospital newsletters from the early 90s, she said. You'll want to see this. My grip tightened on the phone. Meet me in the archives in 30 minutes. I hung up the apartment, suddenly quiet. Their words still lingered. Warnings offers fear disguised as concern. The test was no longer only about Robert's approval or his estate. It was about uncovering what he suspected but never dared say aloud. And for the first time, I knew I wasn't walking into humiliation. I was walking toward the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. The university's special collections room was quiet when I stepped inside, the overhead lights soft against rows of oak shelves. Diane was waiting at a long table with a mug of coffee and several boxes stacked beside her. Box 14, she said, pushing it forward. You'll want to see this. Inside were journals bound in leather, each page filled with Robert Hale's careful handwriting. I slipped on cotton gloves, the familiar ritual steadying me, and opened to the page Diane had marked. The entry was dated September of 1991, 2 months before I was born. His words were blunt. He questioned my mother's absences, her private calls, and her sudden pregnancy. He wrote that the dates didn't add up, that I could not possibly be his child. The room felt suddenly warm. Diane stepped back, giving me space while I traced the indentation of his pen strokes. She set another folder on the table, her tone measured. Hospital newsletters from that same year. Mark Delacroix was in Boston on a fellowship. He and your mother were photographed together at multiple events. I flipped through the pages, each photograph showing them side by side, her hand on his arm, her head tipped back in laughter. I kept turning pages until the math became unavoidable. His fellowship began in early 1990. I was born that November. My breath caught at the simple calculation. Robert's suspicions were not just paranoia. They were supported by time and place. Diane laid another journal in front of me, this one from 4 years earlier. He had written similar doubts during the months before Brooke's birth. For a long time I stared at the two entries, their dates neatly written in the same sharp hand. He had carried these questions for decades, careful enough to preserve them in ink, but never brave enough to voice them aloud. Diane spoke quietly, her words carrying across the stillness. Your mother's name appears in nearly every hospital function report where Delacroix is listed. He was photographed with her more often than with his own colleagues. I organized the documents into a careful folder, building a timeline with photocopies, notes, and highlighted dates. My training guided my hands, turning suspicion into evidence. When I called Brooke, I kept my tone professional. I found records in the archives, I said. You need to see them. Meet me tomorrow at 3. She sighed, impatient, but agreed when I mentioned the documents could affect the inheritance. The next afternoon, she swept into the archives in a cream silk blouse, heels clicking against the stone floor. Her perfume reached the table before she did. She set her handbag down and looked around the room with distaste. I rescheduled a sponsor call for this, she said. It better be important. I slid the folder across the table. It's about Delacroix. She opened it, the first photograph catching her attention immediately, our mothers standing beside the French surgeon, their bodies angled close. Brooke froze, her face paling as she skimmed Robert's journal entries. She whispered, "This is absurd." Her voice lacked conviction. I placed the timeline in front of her. He was in Boston exactly 9 months before my birth, and 9 months before yours. She looked up sharply, her practiced calm slipping. "What are you suggesting?" I held her gaze. "I'm taking the DNA test tomorrow. Are you ready for what it might reveal about both of us?" For the first time in our lives, her certainty wavered. She gathered her things with shaking hands and left without another word. When she was gone, Diane returned with more files. "I found photographs from a different archive," she said. These showed my mother and Delacroix at events Robert hadn't attended, gallery openings, weekend retreats, fundraisers. In every frame, they looked like two people who belonged together. That evening, Alan called. His voice was careful. "I've spoken with colleagues who remember Delacroix. One even remarked how much Brooke resembled him, said he noticed it years ago." I thanked him, though my chest tightened at the weight of confirmation. Back at home, I spread the evidence across my dining table, arranging photographs beside copies of Robert's journal pages. The neat order gave the chaos shape, but it did little to ease the truth settling in. For years, I had believed his distance toward me was personal, aimed only at the daughter who never measured up. Now I saw it differently. He had doubted us both. I sat for a long time staring at the timeline, the years arranged like rungs on a ladder. The test was still ahead, but the paper trail already told a story. The question was no longer whether Robert suspected. It was how much my mother and sister had known, and how long they had kept it buried. The following morning, I scheduled my appointment at a genetics clinic across town. The receptionist processed my forms without pause, handing me a slip with the testing room number. The collection itself took only minutes, a swab sealed and labeled. The technician offered small talk about ancestry searches, but I shook my head. "This isn't about finding distant relatives," I said. "It's about confirming the ones I already have." That night I sat again at the table, every piece of evidence laid out like a map of secrets. Diane arrived with hospital staff directories and dinner in a paper bag. We worked side by side, cross-referencing names, marking connections, and filling the gaps Robert's journals left behind. She paused once, studying a photograph of my mother smiling at Delacroix. "The resemblance to Brooke is striking," she murmured. I didn't answer. The silence said enough. When Diane left, I remained alone with the documents. The house was quiet, but my mind stayed awake. I arranged one last note in the timeline, circling a date in red ink. Tomorrow, the lab would begin its tests, and soon the silence that had stretched over decades would break into words that could not be taken back. The email from the genetics clinic arrived 4 days later. I sat at the dining table, every inch covered with timelines, photocopied newsletters, and photographs spread like a map. The subject line read, "Sample Processing Update." My pulse quickened as I clicked. Instead of the results, the message requested a second collection citing inconclusive markers. The explanation was vague, but the effect was clear. Nothing would be settled yet. I called the lab immediately. The technician on the other end was polite but firm. "Occasionally samples are contaminated," he explained. "Other times unusual markers require additional testing." I asked if that meant the paternity question itself was complicated. He hesitated before admitting that sometimes inconclusive results pointed to unusual family patterns. My stomach tightened as I scheduled a second appointment for the next morning. The following day, I chose a different laboratory across town. Its reputation was stronger, the procedures stricter, the results more difficult to challenge. The waiting room was sterile, the receptionist efficient. Within minutes, a nurse swabbed my cheek and sealed the vial. 10 business days, she said, unless you'd like priority processing. I slid a check across the counter. Priority. She nodded without comment. Back at my apartment, I returned to the evidence wall. Diane arrived with coffee and more staff directories, and together we built out the network of names, dates, and places. At one point, she laid a photograph on the table, my mother laughing beside Marc Delacroix, Brooke's chin dimple mirrored perfectly in his. "It's uncanny," she said softly. I only marked another date on the chart, steadying myself through the routine of order. 2 evenings later, Alan appeared at my door, his briefcase in hand. "I've prepared legal contingencies," he explained as he laid out color-coded folders across my table. Yellow for both of us, as Robert's daughter's green for neither, blue for only one. His hand lingered on the blue. "If Brooke contests the results, she'll likely lean on public sympathy. You need to be prepared for a prolonged fight." His gaze was steady, but the implication pressed heavy on the air. When he left, I sat with the folders spread before me, the weight of every possibility staring back. For the first time, I admitted the possibility that the truth might strip both of us from Robert's legacy. And yet, even knowing that risk, I couldn't turn back. Days passed in a blur of cataloging and waiting. The email finally arrived one morning while I was still at my desk in the archives. "Results available." My finger hovered over the trackpad, hesitant. Diane looked up from her stack of letters. "Do you want me to step out?" she asked. I shook my head. "Stay." The report opened slowly, the clinic's letterhead stark at the top. My eyes skimmed until they landed on the conclusion. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. My breath released in a rush. I was Robert Hale's biological daughter. Relief left me lightheaded, my hands trembling against the desk. But a second attachment blinked below the first. Supplemental report. I opened it and read carefully. The markers showed shared maternal DNA with Brooke, but no paternal match. The words sharpened into certainty. Brooke and I did not share a father. The room was silent except for the hum of the air system. Diane touched my shoulder gently. "That's your answer." That evening I tried to rest, but my phone buzzed with updates from Brooke's social accounts. Photographs of her at Robert's grave, captions about betrayal and psychological cruelty, hashtags about toxic family. The comments poured in with sympathy. She was already controlling the narrative. Alan called not long after. "She's requested an emergency meeting tomorrow. Claims she has new information regarding the will." His voice lowered. "Have you told her the results?" "Not yet," I answered. My hand tightened on the phone. "Then tomorrow we bring everything. Documents, photographs, and both reports." The rain fell against my windows that night as I organized the files into manila folders, each labeled and tabbed. Diane arrived with dinner and helped me prepare duplicates. "She'll try to twist this," she said quietly. I nodded, sliding the supplemental report into the final folder. Not if the evidence speaks first. I lay awake long after she left the folders stacked neatly by the door, the storm pressing against the glass. Tomorrow in Alan's office, the silence of decades would finally end. And with it, the truth Robert had guarded until the very last line of his will. I arrived at Alan Mercer's office early, the leather portfolio heavy on my arm, its contents organized into folders with color-coded tabs. Diane walked beside me carrying duplicates of every record we had uncovered. The receptionist led us into the conference room instead of Alan's office, a long table gleaming under recessed lights, water glasses and legal pads set out like a formal negotiation. Alan entered moments later, his briefcase snapping open as he laid out his own set of files. "They'll be here soon," he said quietly. "Are you ready?" I nodded. The door opened, and my mother and Brooke swept in together, their timing perfect, their appearance carefully coordinated. Marion wore a black suit with her pearls. Brooke in cream linen with gold accessories. They took their seats opposite me, Brooke's eyes flicking to Diane with clear irritation. "I didn't know this was to be a group meeting," my mother said smoothly, her voice touched with artificial concern. Alan gestured to the table. Hannah requested space for documentation. "This is an evidence review as much as a family meeting." I reached into my portfolio and slid the first set of manila folders across the table, one to each of them. Marion opened hers first, her polished calm cracking as she reached the highlighted section of the DNA report. Brooke followed her expression, draining of color as she read. "These tests are often inaccurate," Marion said sharply. "Surely a second opinion is needed." I lifted another folder from my bag and placed it between us. Anticipated. Verified by a different laboratory. Same result. Alan adjusted his glasses and nodded. "Both reports appear scientifically sound and are legally admissible." Brooke snapped her folder shut. "This is absurd. A mistake on paper doesn't erase 34 years of my life." I laid my hand on the portfolio and opened the next section. "It isn't just the DNA. We've assembled a full timeline." Diane slid the first document across the table, a hospital staff directory from 1986, listing Marc Delacroix as visiting cardiovascular surgeon. Beside it, she placed a dated photograph of my mother standing with him at a fundraising gala. Brooke's chin dimple mirrored his in the yellowed image. Marion reached for her water glass, her hand trembling slightly. I spoke steadily. "The reports confirm Brooke and I share only maternal DNA, different fathers. I am Robert Hale's daughter. She is not." Diane placed another newsletter on the table, dated December 1986, showing Delacroix and Marion listed as co-chairs for a holiday fundraiser. Robert appeared in the background, standing apart. The silence stretched until Brooke broke it, her voice unsteady. "You've been planning this humiliation all along, just like Robert did." I met her eyes steady against the accusation. "I only followed the truth. He suspected it. Now it's confirmed." Marian folded her hands flat on the table as if bracing herself. Her voice softened, almost breaking. Robert and I were struggling. He was never home. Mark was kind when Robert was cold. It was brief, but it happened before he returned to France. Alan cleared his throat, his professional tone returning. The legal implications are clear. The will required biological relation to Dr. Hale to inherit the company and liquid assets. Under the conditions, Hannah is the confirmed heir. The assistants at the edge of the room tried to mask their reactions, but the words landed like a final gavel. Brooke pushed back from the table, mascara streaking her cheeks. So that's it. 35 years of being Robert's daughter erased by a line in a lab report. Her voice cracked, and for the first time I saw the collapse behind her polished exterior. The victory I had anticipated felt heavy rather than triumphant. I took a breath and spoke quietly. The will defines the inheritance. What I choose to do with it afterward is my decision. I intend to establish a trust for you, Brooke, and provisions for Mother. Alan looked up surprised. You're under no obligation. I met his gaze. I know. But obligation isn't the point. Marian slumped slightly in her chair, the posture she had maintained for years breaking in an instant. Why would you do this, Hannah? After everything, I gathered the reports and slid them back into my folder, careful with the pages, because Robert's final lesson wasn't about DNA or control. It was about understanding the difference between what the law calls family and what we choose as family. Brooke wiped at her cheeks, confusion written plainly across her face. I don't understand you, she whispered. I looked at her steadily. You don't have to. Just know I won't erase you no matter what the paper says. Alan began outlining the framework for a modified agreement, his pen moving quickly across the pad. Diane quietly gathered the extra documents, slipping them back into the portfolio. As the meeting wound down, the air in the room shifted. The weight of Robert's stipulation was lifted. The truth acknowledged the path forward, however uneasy, set into motion. I stood smoothing my skirt and looked at Brooke one last time. Her expression held no triumph, only shock and uncertainty. Marian avoided my eyes, her fingers twisting the strand of pearls she had worn like armor. Walking out of the office, Diane at my side, I felt the weight of the confrontation settle behind me. The silence of decades had broken. Ahead was not revenge or ruin, but the chance to build something new out of the truth that had finally come to light. The morning after the meeting, the storm shifted from polished conference tables to public screens. Brooke's Instagram lit with a new post, a black and white portrait of her gazing solemnly, mascara faintly smeared hand resting against Robert's headstone. The caption read, "When family betrayal cuts deeper than grief, some secrets should have stayed buried. #, truth hurts. # healing journey." Comments poured in hundreds within the hour. Messages of sympathy, outrage, and support. Diane sat across from me at my dining table, scrolling through the flood on her phone. She's painting herself as the victim before the ink is even dry, she said quietly. I leaned back, the folders of evidence stacked neatly beside me. She's setting the stage, Alan called that evening, his voice low with concern. Her attorney has already filed preliminary objections. Claims Robert was not of sound mind when he added the DNA clause. They've lined up 2 colleagues to testify about supposed paranoia in his final months. I gripped the phone, forcing my voice steady. He was operating until 3 weeks before his death. How could they say that Alan sighed? It's a tactic to delay proceedings. We need to prepare for a long fight. That night, the rain tapped against the glass while Diane unpacked takeout containers across my dining table, her presence a calm anchor. We laid the evidence out again, the DNA reports, the hospital directories, the photographs of my mother, and Delacroix. Alan spread the legal filings Brooke's attorney had prepared, thick with objections, demands for additional testing, and claims of undue influence. She's trying to drag you into court, Alan explained, tapping the pages. If she succeeds, every private detail of your family history becomes public record. The thought pressed heavily. My career depended on discretion and trust, the ability to guard archives with quiet integrity. A courtroom battle would pull that apart in front of strangers. My phone buzzed with a message from Marian. Brooke says she'll drop everything if you agree to split the estate 50-50. Please, Hannah, be reasonable. I handed the phone across the table to Alan. He read it, his brow lifting. That's an interesting development. She knows she has no legal ground. Diane's voice was softer. She's afraid. The DNA results must have shaken her. Alan opened his briefcase again and laid out another folder. I secured the full reports from both laboratories, including supplemental analysis. They show you and Brooke share maternal DNA, but no paternal markers in common. The science is unshakable. His eyes met mine. She's known since her own preliminary results arrived 3 days ago. This campaign isn't about shock, it's strategy. I stared at the folder, the words blurring for a moment before they sharpened again. Brooke wasn't reacting in pain. She was preemptively rewriting the story for her audience. If she casts herself as the victim of Robert's cruelty, she preserves her image, Diane said quietly, echoing my thoughts. We worked late organizing the evidence into a formal presentation. Diane highlighted key passages Alan marked, which documents were strongest in court. When the clock passed midnight, I gathered the reports into 3 identical binders, their spines labeled in bold type. The following morning, Marion called. Her voice wavered between anger and pleading. Whatever you think you've uncovered, you'll destroy this family if you reveal it. Brooke is protecting herself. Can you blame her? These DNA tests are often wrong. Dr. Greenwald says false results happen all the time. I held the phone steady. They're not wrong, Mother. Not this time. Silence stretched before she spoke again, her tone brittle. Brooke will contest the will no matter what your test shows. Is that what you want for strangers to pick apart our lives in court? The line between her voice and Brooke's lawyer blurred in my mind, one argument bleeding into the next. I answered carefully. I didn't seek this. Robert required it. By afternoon, Brooke posted again. A black and white shot of herself staring into the camera, a caption about surviving narcissistic abuse and wills used as weapons. The comments filled with outrage, her followers rushing to her defense. The narrative she spun was complete. She was the wrong daughter. The cruel stipulation was a final act of control, and I was invisible in the story she told. That evening, Diane arrived with Alan in tow. He removed his coat, rain dripping from the hem, and placed another stack of papers on the table. Brooke's attorney filed additional motions today. They're claiming psychological abuse that Robert's paranoia invalidates the will. Diane shook her head. It's smoke and mirrors. Alan's expression was stern. Perhaps, but it's effective in the court of public opinion. If we want to win legally, we must be as precise as Robert was. We worked again through the night, the 3 of us around the dining table, papers spread like pieces of a puzzle. I labeled Diane organized, Alan dictated strategy. By dawn, the binders held everything in chronological order, photographs, reports, newsletters, and journal entries all documented and authenticated. As I closed the final binder, the exhaustion caught up with me. My hand lingered on the cover, the neat letters spelling out Whitaker family evidence. Diane touched my shoulder. You've turned suspicion into fact, Hannah. No one can take that away. Alan checked his watch and gathered his papers. Tomorrow we present this formally. Brooke has chosen spectacle. We'll choose precision. Let the evidence speak. I walked him to the door, the early morning light breaking pale across the wet street. Brooke's posts, my mother's calls, the legal filings, they were all noise. What mattered now sat in the binders lined neatly on my table. The truth Robert had forced into the open was ready to be spoken. The next morning, I carried the binders into Alan's conference room, their weight both physical and final. Diane walked beside me, her arms full of authenticated newsletters and photographs carefully sealed in protective sleeves. Alan was already there, arranging water glasses and setting out legal pads at each place around the table. We'll let the evidence speak, he said, his voice steady. The door opened at precisely 10. Marion entered first, dressed in navy, with her pearls perfectly aligned, followed by Brooke in pale gray, her expression carefully composed. They sat across from me, their movements practiced like a performance rehearsed for an audience they could no longer control. Alan gestured for us to begin. I slid the first binder across the table. Marion opened hers, quickly, eyes scanning the highlighted report. Brooke hesitated, then unfolded the cover and stared at the words confirming what she already knew. Shared maternal DNA, no paternal markers in common. She closed it again, her lips tightening. These reports are wrong, she said sharply. You can't erase a lifetime with a lab result. Alan's voice was even. Two separate laboratories, both with priority analysis, both reaching the same conclusion. Legally, this is definitive. I opened the second section and spread photographs across the polished wood. The DNA is only part of the story. These documents show where our mother stood and with whom during the months Robert questioned his marriage. Diane placed a dated hospital directory beside the photographs, Mark Delacroix's name marked clearly. My mother's hand, caught in a candid frame, rested lightly on his arm. Marion inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around her folder. Robert was distant. Mark was kind. That's all it was. Her voice trembled, but the truth was already on the table. Brooke pushed back from her chair, her eyes shining. So what now? Everything I've built, all of it, was based on being Robert's daughter. Do you know what this does to me? I met her gaze. You're still my sister. That doesn't change. She shook her head, mascara smudging as tears slipped down her cheeks. Not his. Never his. And now the world will know. Alan cleared his throat and returned to the will. Under Robert's conditions, Hannah is the sole heir to Hale Medical Technologies and the specified liquid assets. Marion, your inheritance remains unchanged. Brooke, legally you receive the vacation property and your trust fund. Brooke's voice cracked. So that's it? A test decides who we are. The room fell quiet. I gathered the reports back into my portfolio, stacking them neatly before speaking. The will defines what I inherit. But it doesn't decide what I do with it. I intend to establish a trust in your name, Brooke, and provisions for Mother. Alan looked surprised, but I continued. The company remains under my care. The rest will provide for you both. Marion's posture sagged, her hands finally still against the table. After everything we've done to you, why I closed the portfolio carefully, each document aligned as if order itself could carry me forward. Because the truth was, Robert's last gift, not his punishment. I won't use it as a weapon. Brooke pressed her palms against her face, her voice muffled. I don't understand you, Hannah. I studied her quietly, seeing not the sister who always stood in the spotlight, but someone equally marked by Robert's choices. You don't have to. Just know that I won't let you disappear because of this. Alan began outlining the new agreement, his pen moving steadily across the legal pad. Diane collected the extra documents, sliding them back into their sleeves. The formal rhythm of law filled the space where silence had lived for decades. When the meeting ended, we left together. Diane walked close beside me, the rain tapping softly against the tall windows as we stepped into the hallway. Behind us, Marion and Brooke remained at the table, one clutching her pearls, the other staring blankly at the evidence she could not deny. Outside, the air was cool and damp, carrying the weight of everything spoken inside. For the first time since Robert's funeral, I felt the quiet certainty of closure pressing forward. Yet I also knew Brooke's silence would not hold. There would be fallout, public and private, before anything resembling peace could take shape. The weeks after that final meeting passed quietly, though the silence was different now. It was not the kind born of suspicion or avoidance, but one shaped by honesty finally spoken aloud. Papers were filed, signatures inked, and the estate shifted into new hands. Hale Medical Technologies became mine to guide not as Robert's shadow, but as my own responsibility. The board accepted Alan's counsel, and with time the weight of their cautious stare softened into trust. At home, my days were steadier. Diane still arrived with her folders and a bag of takeout more often than not, her laughter filling corners of my apartment that once knew only solitude. Together, we built the structure of the new trust, one that provided for Brooke and ensured my mother's future was secure. When the paperwork was complete, Alan slid it across the table toward me with a faint smile. "You've given more than Robert asked of you," he said. I nodded, knowing that was the point. Marion took longer to face me. When she did, her pearls were absent, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. She came to my apartment unannounced, clutching a weathered photograph of Robert and me at one of his conferences. She stood at the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "I should have told you the truth years ago," she said softly. Her words trembled, but they were honest. I invited her in, and for the first time, we spoke without performance. Brooke disappeared from social media for a while. The silence from her once constant posts was louder than any caption she had ever written. Months later, she called her voice uneven. "I've started over," she told me. "I needed distance, but I'm finding my footing." She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't demand it. We spoke as sisters, not heirs, not rivals, not reflections of Robert's conditions. Just sisters. It was enough for now. 1 year later, the company's lobby bore a new plaque, the Whitaker Hale Foundation for Genetic Research. It funded scholarships for students who studied the ethics of family and medicine, a legacy that carried both Robert's rigor and my own belief in transparency. Diane stood beside me during the unveiling, her smile steady, while Alan clasped my shoulder with quiet pride. The following spring, I visited Robert's grave alone. The grass had grown in the stone cleaned by time and weather. I placed a small bouquet of white lilies at the base and rested my hand on the cool granite. "You left me a test," I whispered. I found the answer, and now I've chosen what to do with it. The breeze carried through the cemetery, a gentle sound that felt like release. Life didn't return to what it was, it became something new. Marian learned to call without rehearsed lines, her voice warmer each time. Brooke sent the occasional photo from a small apartment far from Boston, her smile tentative but real. And I found myself breathing easier, the constant weight of uncertainty no longer pressing down. What Robert left behind wasn't just wealth or conditions. It was the chance to separate love from suspicion, to build a life not out of fear, but out of truth. The inheritance I value most is not the company or the trust fund. It is the freedom to know who I am and to choose what kind of family I want to build. If you've listened this far, I hope you carry this with you too, that even the hardest truths can open doors to peace. Family isn't always the history written for us. Sometimes it's the honesty we insist on and the kindness we choose to give anyway. Thank you for being here with me. Before you go, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, and if this story spoke to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it.